Thank you, everyone, for attending, and welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable for March 15th, 2023. My name is Adam Benson. I'm the Assistant Director of Library and Archives at the History Center. We're happy to continue our partnership with the York Civil War Roundtable and returning to in-person after 2 months of trying to avoid winter weather, which didn't come. Well, the cold came, but not the icy road conditions that we anticipated. So before I turn things over to Scott Rosenau, who will introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to go over a few obligatory announcements of upcoming events at the History Center over the next few weeks. First of all, this coming Friday, you might be aware, is a national holiday of sorts for a lot of people. March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, we are hosting the Spirits of the Past event, which we started last year. It went very successfully. But anyway, on this St. Patrick's Day, you can come at, I believe it's 7 p.m. in this room and learn the history behind and how to make an Irish maid and Irish coffee. And you also get to imbibe those drinks. So if you're interested, please check out our website for those. On March 22nd, that's a week from tonight, we'll be welcoming back the All Vets organization, and that will be at 7 p.m. Dr. Jack Klein will be here, and Jack Klein was an Army veteran. He served in the Medical Corps in the Vietnam War between 1963 and 1965. So he'll be here next week to talk about his experience. Many of you, if you're on Facebook or read the newspaper, are probably aware that there are a lot of historic properties that are currently endangered around York County. The History Center has heard of people's concerns, and we are hosting the Historic Preservation in Your Community event, which is taking place on March 25th. That's a Saturday at 10:30 a.m. again in this room, and we'll be welcoming Mindy Crawford, who is the Executive Director of Preservation Pennsylvania, and she'll be presenting a 2-hour program from 10:30 to 12:30 about things that you can do in your community to help preserve historic properties. On the following Saturday, on April 1st, we'll be, I think, starting out our new series called All About. And this Saturday on April 1st, it will be all about grist mills, and that'll be taking place at the Agricultural and Industrial Museum, where we actually have a grist mill. That starts at 11 o'clock a.m. and there are events that go through the morning and afternoon. That's on Saturday, April 11th. Saturday, April 1st. Slow down. Okay. On Sunday, April 2nd, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be here starting at 2:30, running until 4. And the Genealogy Society will be welcoming member Jonathan Stayer, who will be presenting parts of his research on researching Pennsylvania's Civil War draft records. So that may be of interest to all of you. Mr. Stayer has done a lot of work on transcribing these records, and actually the last few publications of the PGS have been transcriptions of those records. So if you're interested in that topic and looking to see what draft records are available for York County, please come to that program, or you could check out some of their publications. And finally, I talked about this the last 2 months in January and February online, but our Distinguished Speaker Series is coming up on April 18th. I think that's a Tuesday night, because our next roundtable meeting is the 19th. So Tuesday, April 18th, the historian and journalist Eric Larson will be coming to York. He will be interviewed by WITF's Scott Lamar, and this is taking place at 8 p.m. at the Appel Center for the Performing Arts. So please check out our website to get tickets. I think there are still a few available. And you might also know, if you came in through the door tonight, that we are slowly collecting copies of Eric Larson's many books. So if you're interested in the things he's written about, he has 2 different books that cover World War II topics. One on the Lusitania, I believe, one on the more famous one. I think his first big book was Devil in the White City, about the Columbian Exposition. So anyway, we'll have a number of those books for sale from our bookstore. And that's all I have. So I'm going to get out of the way and turn things over to Scott.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for hosting us here at the York County History Center. We want to welcome back our live audience here. Glad to see people here, and I'm sure a lot of you are glad to be here. We also do want to welcome those who are watching us virtually through Zoom and Facebook Live. Just before we get into tonight's speaker, again, I want to thank the History Center for hosting our events. I want to thank Kathy Friel, who does set up all of our speakers, and she does a lot of hard work to get our speakers here each month, and want to thank her for all of her hard work that she puts into those scheduling efforts. Looking toward next month, like Adam said, we're going to be meeting on Wednesday, April 19th, and we're going to be welcoming Samantha Dorm as she speaks about the U.S. Colored Troops of the Lebanon Cemetery. The cemetery was founded in 1872 and is located right up the road here at 1412 North George Street. It's the final resting place for the remains of more than 3,500 African Americans, including abolitionists, Underground Railroad conductors, Civil War soldiers, Buffalo soldiers, Tuskegee Airmen, artists, educators, religious leaders, physicians, and much more, all together based on the color of their skin. Her presentation will spotlight the U.S. Colored Troops who are interred at Lebanon Cemetery. Samantha is a grant writer, and as she says, a reluctant historian, and one of the driving forces behind the Friends of the Lebanon Cemetery. The organization was created in December of 2020, and it works to honor the early African American community members of York County by remembering their legacies and sharing their stories. Through volunteer efforts, the Friends of Lebanon Cemetery serves to uncover the rich history of York County's African American burial grounds by researching, identifying, and documenting the people interred in the cemetery, linking familial ties, preserving and restoring not just their locations, but their stories. Even in death, there was segregation. Tonight, we welcome Randy Drais. Randy's a member of this roundtable. He was born and raised in York, Pennsylvania, graduate of York College with a BA in International Studies. He's worked in Pennsylvania House of Representatives, the Senate, Department of State, and he's co-author of the book Texans at Gettysburg, Blood and Glory with Hood's Texas Brigade. He's currently providing assistance on a book about a famous Yorker that we've heard much about here at the roundtable, Edmund Ned Spangler, and his life and role in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. He also has a website, battleofgettysburgbuff.com, also a website, a Facebook page, and he has a quarterly newsletter that he sends out as well. So let's give a nice welcome to Randy as he presents to us about women of Gettysburg.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me back. It's been a long time. It's nice to be back behind the podium. This is my, yes, I did one or two last year, one with a Zoom and one was actually in person. So I guess people are getting back into the flow. This is a topic that I put together a couple of years ago. I've done it several times, and Kathy had asked me to do it because of it being Women in History Month. Very appropriate topic, and I'm sure you know some of the people, some of the women here, but I'm sure you don't know who that is. Or this lady, you know who that one is, probably. You might know that one. You know that one, I'm sure, and that one. So we'll get into the program. Next slide, please. I don't hear the clicker. Was that what?
Yeah, that might be what you brought. Clicker.
There's one under the podium, I can see it. Battery.
Yeah.
There, I advanced it for you.
You check.
Well,
Close the line. Okay. Oh, I understand. Down. Yep, put the downs. The red. No, this one. All right, thank you.
Sure, sorry about that.
See, we're all out of practice to some degree. Right. All right, Elizabeth Thorne. How many people know who Elizabeth Thorne is? Okay. She was the wife of the caretaker, Peter Thorne, who was in the army at the time. He enlisted in August of '62. They had already had 3 sons, all under the age of 7. And with basically only her father's help during the battle, she buried about 90 soldiers. Now, her father obviously was older, so he probably didn't have a whole lot of help for her, but the main thing was she kept, as her quotes, we kept on burying the soldiers until they had the National Cemetery ready. And at that time, we buried 105 soldiers. She had done 90 during the battle, or right after. In front of the house, there were 15 dead horses, and beside the cemetery, there were 19 in that field. So you may know it was only excitement that helped me do all the work with all that stench. And then 3 months after, she was 7 months pregnant or 6 months pregnant at the time when she's burying these soldiers. I had a dear little baby, but it was not very strong. And from that time on, my health failed, and for years I was a very sickly woman. In my older days, my health has been better, but those hard days have always been told on my life. And unfortunately, that daughter that was born shortly thereafter was very ill and did not last very long. So obviously the stress on the body from burying those soldiers took a toll on Elizabeth and her daughter. Peter Thorne returns home after Appomattox in '65, and the family remained in Evergreen Cemetery as caretakers. Elizabeth Thorne died in 1907 and is buried in Evergreen Cemetery. In 2002, a Civil War Women's Memorial was dedicated. Memorials within Evergreen Cemetery near the gatehouse and depicts Elizabeth attending to her burial duties. Her face, as you can see on the next slide, is full of anguish. An apron covers her pregnant abdomen, and she holds a spade representing all she did. I don't know where the slide was there. Oh. There we go. You can see the abdomen. If you take a look, you ever go out there and look, there's a spent mini ball carved in the bronze. Little detail, will not be on the quiz. I knew a lady who was the descendant of Elizabeth Thorne. She had seen my website and Facebook page and contacted me, and her mother, who would have been like her grandmother, great granddaughter, well, somewhere along that line. And she ended up asking me to see if I could get some friends to attend to her mother's burial in the cemetery near Elizabeth Thorne. So that was a nice little tribute for the Thornes, all of them. Because she did not know that many people. My friend lived near Philadelphia, and she did not know that many local people that could come out for the funeral. So that's my connection to Elizabeth Thorne. All right, how many people have heard of French Mary? Right, really? Of course you did, Scott. Marie Teddy 114th Pennsylvania Infantry. That's where this photograph is taken, the abbreviated version. That's looking out from the Evergreen Cemetery entrance to Cemetery Hill, and that's where that view is, and that is her to the right. Little background. Seeing a woman in the Civil War battle of Spotsylvania surprised a veteran officer of the 8th Ohio. There's your Ohio connection. She was in a Zouave uniform at that, and that astonished him even more. She was the famous Vivandier Marie Tepe, who served with the 114th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. Vivandiers appeared in European armies, especially in France, as women who were part of a regiment and provided the sale of spirits and other comforts and attended to the sick. And also, I'm sure he did some other duties such as cleaning, washing, whatever, for the sake of the regiment. Over the years, they were known to wear the uniform of the regiment. Over the years, the status of Vivandiers changed, and in 1865, a regulation appointed a certain number of women to each section of the French army. Such courage existed among women in America when the Civil War began. There were women who were ready to join with their men, and we know some of those men fought as soldiers alongside their husbands in disguise. Marie Tepe was one such courageous woman. She was originally born in France, raised by her father, later moved to the U.S. When she was nearly 20 years of age, she married Bernard Tepe, a Philadelphia tailor. When the war began, she joined the 27th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, and then as soon as her husband left, so did Marie, despite Bernard wanting her to stay and mind the tailor shop. In the spring of '61, she became a Vivandier with the 27th PA, and later became connected with the 114th. The original company of that regiment was organized in the early weeks of August of '61 by Captain Collis, who has a good monument over in Gettysburg in the cemetery with his bust. He raised 9 companies that formed the 114th with himself as colonel. Like the original company, the 114th was a Zouave unit. How many people know what a chasseur regiment is? Similar to Zouave, but they were more like light infantry, but basically the same thing. So there's one monument on the battlefield that has chasseurs on it. I'll let you look into that in the next. So she wore a Zouave uniform, and when she left at 27, she went to Collis's regiment. She wore a blue jacket and red pants, and to distinguish herself from the men, she wore a skirt trimmed in red. She also was wounded during the Battle of Fredericksburg. What we was in the ankle, and for her bravery during the battle, she received the Kearney Cross, which was awarded for valor to members of the 1st Division of the 3rd Army Corps in memory of its 1st Division commander, General Phil Kearney. After a short hospitalization, she rejoined the regiment. July '63, Marie and the regiment joined the fight at Gettysburg. When the battle was over, she volunteered her services as a nurse to help the wounded. After a few weeks of tending to the injured, she returned to her regiment and served throughout the rest of the war and later moved to Pittsburgh. Here's the Kearney Cross. And she died in 1901. Now we all know the story about Jenny Wade, Georgia McCollum, her sister, just had a baby. She the only civilian known that we know of to have lost her life during the battle. The Breckenridge Street was at her sister's house, along with her mother, brother, and 6-year-old boarder, Isaac. And her sister, as we know, had just given birth. McCollins lived on the opposite side of the home. Jenny was a seamstress like her mother. The home, while not in the middle of the actual battle, was in close proximity. And as we all know, as she was providing water and bread for the soldiers and making bread that one morning of her death, A bullet went through the door. Would have been on the other side, that side door. I don't know, that could be the one, but there's an old photo, as you see. It's very possible that the sniper was from the driver house, trying to pick off Union infantry or artillery. For Janet, her sister, was married to a Virginian captain of the 10th Company, Adams County Commissioner, militia, was her husband James Wade. Georgia became the first of 6 children living at Baltimore Street and worked where as tailors. Captain Wade was absent for prolonged periods, and Mary Ann moved Georgia and her siblings into Breckenridge Street, up the road. At age 14, Georgia began learning the millinery business, continuing in her trade until her marriage in '62 to John McClellan, private company of the 2nd PA Regiment, Infantry Regiment. She moved to Baltimore Street, where her sister was killed. Georgia and her husband lived there until 1866, when they moved to Denison, Iowa, to get a fresh start. One of the boulders from Devil's Den was requested through her as part of the DAR, and the Park Commission allowed them to get a big boulder. I don't know how many tons, to Denison, Iowa, and it's still there in a nice display as part of the history of Gettysburg. There are several boulders throughout the United States from the battlefield, including one up in Harrisburg on the base of the Doughboy statue. That's also from Devil's statue. But one of the biggest ones is the one in Denison, Iowa. We all know about Kelly Pierce. She was 15 years old during the battle. She was sent from her home on Baltimore Street to take 2 younger neighborhood girls, Molly and Sadie Shriver, their next door neighbors, to their girls' grandmother's house south of town. That would be the Jacob Wyckoff farm. This was a relatively good place to be on the first day of the battle, but not on the second day, as we know, and to a certain extent on the third. On the second day, with the battle rolling towards the Union left and centering in the wheat field, the beech orchard, and the round tops, the Wyckoff farm became a fast field hospital. Billy saw her share of dead and wounded and gave a drink of water to General Meade. He had come by on a horse and he asked for a drink. So she actually talked to General Meade. He also talked with General Meade, who was desperate, severely mortally wounded on the round top of the fight in a second. And she later wrote a book about her personal experiences. After the war was over, she met a young man who was a student at the Lutheran Seminary. He married in 1871. He moved to Selinsgrove, raised 3 children, and died in 1914 in nearby Philadelphia. That book is still available in print at most bookstores and probably on Amazon. It's a very good read. Again, 15 years old. Now, everybody's heard of the Thompson house. Have you ever seen a picture of Mary Thompson, the widow Thompson? How you do? And there's a before and after photograph. I'm a dog owner. There's a doghouse. I pay attention to the details. So when the park or the trust rebuilt, restored the Thompson house, they put the doghouse back. Anna Mary Long was born 1793 near Littlestown. Her first husband was Daniel Sell. She had 3 daughters through him, but he died at age 30 in 1822. 4 years later, she married Joshua Thompson, who would have 2 sons and 3 daughters with him. He was a drunkard and disappeared sometime after 1841 and presumed dead. Mary had the good fortune to be friends with Gettysburg Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, an abolitionist, and he forced behind the passage of the 13th Amendment ending slavery, to the effect that he paid basically or gave her rent-free the property. He took care of any expenses for the property. After the disappearance of Mary's husband, she took the money she had inherited from her father Stevens and asked him to purchase Stone House and Trust. Although Stevens' name was on the deed, Mary owned the home. And there she lived there the rest of her life. For how many years thereafter, Mary cooked and washed laundry at the Lutheran Seminary, a short distance away. She appears in the June 1860 census in Adams County as living at the old stone house in Cumberland Township by herself. Her children had all moved away by 1860. In July of 63, she was 69 years old, known by the residents of the town as the Widow Thompson. And we all know that General Lee's staff chose the house as headquarters. And you can see famous photographs and paintings and such of the house and General Lee and that type of action there. She died in 1873. Now, I find it interesting that the Union commander also had the widow's house for, headquarters. I don't know if there's a connection. I'm not trying to be smart. I'm like, just it gets very odd that they're both widows. We know Lydia Leicester house. Old photos. Modern photo to the right. She was a widow of James Leicester. She had purchased in 1861 a 9-acre farm with a small log house on the Tommytown Road. She moved in with her 6 children, the youngest being only 3 years old. 2 years later, she was forced out of her home when the battle came to her doorsteps. We all know General Meade took command of the house. Lydia and her children did so well rebuilding the farm from the devastation resulting from the war, that she was able to purchase an additional 7 acres in 1868. That's pretty uncommon. A lot of the farms they had to sell because they couldn't recuperate the losses. The Cadore farm for one, and the Bliss farm for another. They ended up also building a 2-story addition to the farmhouse, which the park had, but then they tore down to make it look more like the original one. By 1879, she decided to sell her farm to the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, move into the town. She must have had a great affection for her home, for she decided to take it with her. She purchased a lot near the Dobbin House on the Gettysburg Road. Here she moved the 1874 section of her home. She lived there until 1893 and is buried in Evergreen Cemetery. So you can go home again, but sometimes home can go to you. Now, how many have been to this house? I posted on Facebook on Halloween. I said, this is the perfect house for Halloween in Gettysburg, in the battlefield. All right, here's another widow. Catherine Hagen was a widow. Her husband had died in 1848. And she lived just along the Baltimore Pike, just east of Powers Hill, right at the intersection to the south of Powers Hill Road. She owned a farm along the Gettysburg Road, and with Union troops all around her, being alone, she traveled to the Sherpy farm to get out of harm's way. However, heavy fighting occurred there, as we know, during the famous Beach Orchard. Even as skirmishers fought in the fields, Catherine walked across the farm yard on the afternoon of July 2nd. A stray mini ball passed through a fence and struck the folds of her skirts. She picked up the ball and kept it as a souvenir. A Union officer soon ordered the Sherpies away on account of danger, which they promptly obeyed after seeing what was going on. They went further south on the Baltimore Pike Road. They reunited a few miles behind. Union lines, died in 1864, age 81. So I count her as possibly the first souvenir hunter, or collector, should I say, not hunter. The American Battlefield Trust bought that house, I think 6 years ago, and I've been emailing them because every now and then I'll take friends over to look at it and show it. And especially over Halloween, and the foundation is getting worse and worse and worse. And I'm really concerned about it. The ABT says they are looking at coming up with a plan this year. I hope they do, because it'd be terrible to lose that property.
Randy, where is it?
I'm sorry,
Where is the house?
if you have the Baltimore Pike and Powers Hill, and then the road that goes back is Grand Schoolhouse Lane. There's a little parking area there. The old mini golf course. Okay. On the south, see if you look at the four-way intersection, it'll be on the southwest corner. You can more or less see it during the spring or fall or winter. No, sorry, because all the foliage. All right, Josephine Miller. At the time of the battle, there was a one-story log farmhouse here in the property, which was the home of Peter Rogers. His wife Susan and their granddaughter Josephine Miller, a single woman, 23 years of age. Peter Rogers is said to have stayed in the house during the battle with his wife Susan, while his wife Susan took refuge east of the Round Tops with family members. Josephine stayed behind as well with her grandfather during the battle, baking bread and carrying water to thirsty soldiers. On July 2nd, Josephine was in the kitchen baking bread. A Union officer later wrote that he told Josephine to leave home immediately, but she had bread baking in the oven, and she would stay till it was done. After the fighting was over for the day, she remained at the farm caring for wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederate. In a reunion address later, General Henry Slocum made this statement: "The great artillery duel which shook the earth for miles around did not drive her from her oven. Pickett's men who charged past her house found her quietly baking her bread and distributing it to the hungry. When the battle was over, her house was found to be riddled with shot and shell, and 17 dead bodies were taken from the house and cellar. The bodies of wounded men who crawled to the little dwelling for shelter." She died in 1911. However, during the dedication of this monument, I think it's Andrew Sharpshooters. I'd have to double check. I'm sorry. It's first man. First man. They had the dedication of the monument, and they asked her to be in the photo. And that's her in the forefront. They also have a photo somewhere where she also brought out the for the photo we need. All right, so we all know about Union soldiers, female Union soldiers during the Civil War. There are a couple that we know of that were female at Gettysburg. And one of the Union soldiers, females, was from New York, later identified as Mary Seasgold. But the other was a young teenage girl who still remains identified to this day. Both women survived the bloody battle, although the young teenage girl received minor wounds during the fighting. The three female Confederate soldiers mentioned in "They Fought Like Demons," who also remained identified due to poor record keeping, they were also not as lucky. One was shot in the leg and captured. She was sent to a military hospital in Chester, PA, where doctors amputated her leg. A Union soldier recuperated in the hospital at the same time as the young woman. Thomas Reed wrote to his parents in August 1863. I must tell you that we have a female success here. She was wounded at Gettysburg, but our doctors soon found her out. They say she is very good looking, but the poor girl who had lost a leg. It's a great pity she did not stay at home with her mother, but she gets good care and kind treatment. The other two female Confederate soldiers mentioned in the book at Gettysburg did not make it off the battlefield alive. They were both mortally wounded during Pickett's charge. One of the women died while storming a stone wall along Cemetery Ridge. And another later died on the field in that area. A male Union soldier guarding the Emmitsburg Road that evening heard one of the women's cries as she was dying on the battlefield and described it as the most awful sound he had ever heard. The bodies were later discovered by our Union burial detail as the Confederates had retreated and left their dead and wounded behind. Going to women in the Civil War, two Confederate women soldiers who were cousins, Mary and Molly Bell, who served under General Burley, did survive the Battle of Gettysburg, as well as about her chance to go about Scott's and Vegas courthouse in 1864, until their true identities were discovered. And they were sent to a Confederate prison before being released when their combat exploits were confirmed, and that they had not simply been camp followers. The girls were 15 and 20 years old from Pulaski County, Virginia, and enlisted in the Army, Confederate Army, under false identities. Mary as Tom Parker and Molly as Bob Morgan or Bob Martin. It depends on the records that you see. It has not yet been confirmed that they were at Gettysburg, but it's very likely because they have no records that they weren't. And again, they were not found out until '64, and they had been seen in other battles and enlisted long before Gettysburg. All right, to get back to some of the Union women, because we talked about French Mary, here's another one you may know of or may not. Annie and Anna Etheridge, depending on what you read or where you look her up on the internet. She born in 1839 in Detroit. She had already been a nurse in a Michigan hospital. She was reared in luxury, but her father met with misfortune with his business ventures. She married James Etheridge when he enlisted in '61 in the 2nd Michigan Infantry, and she joined as a nurse and Vivandier, later transferring to the 3rd and 5th Michigan regiments, so that she remained with the Army of the Potomac. They call her Michigan Annie. And she's often found on the front lines caring for the wounded, where most soldiers wouldn't dare venture. She packed 2 pistols and rode a horse that hauled saddlebags filled with medical supplies. She was the battles of First and Second Bull Run, Williamsburg, Chancellorsville, before getting to Gettysburg. During one battle, when victory appeared hopeless, she shouted words of encouragement that inspired the men to fight on and win. One soldier later recounted, all the officers in the Army of the Potomac would not have had as much influence over the men as did Annie on her little road mare. On May 27, 1863, Annie was awarded the Kearney Cross, Union Combat Decoration awarded to soldiers for overwhelming bravery, as we mentioned before. Medal of Honor recipient, Brevet Major General Claire Mulholland, recalled observing Annie during the 2nd day of the battle at Gettysburg in the area around the Feet George. Amidst cannon shot that was throwing up loose dirt around the farm, a woman on horseback in uniform galloped back from the front, back from the line of the battle, asking for some information and quickly returned to the front again. She was a nurse of the 3rd Corps, Anna Etheridge, and was directing the removal of the wounded. She was cool and self-possessed and did not seem to mind the fire. She went on to serve in many more other Civil War battles, and she spoke about her pension papers. When camped in Jeffersonville, Indiana, July 5th, 1865, I was presented with an official copy of the battles which we had participated in, nearly every one of which I had been with my command, giving my services as a nurse. She was listed as being in 32 battles. After the war, she married a third time, veteran of the 7th Connecticut Infantry Regiment, and settled in D.C., where she obtained a job in the Treasury Department. She died on January 23rd, 1913, and she's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, here's another lady that you probably don't know. Sophronia Buckland. She had gone to Washington, D.C. a year earlier to offer herself to Dorothea Dix, who was the head of the nurses. Dix first refused Buckland's offer to become a nurse because Buckland was under 30 years of age, and Dix feared the work would be too hard for her. Buckland was working at the Arbor Orphanage and refused to take no for an answer. She arrived at Dix's door in D.C., and because of the great need for nurses, she was finally and immediately sent to work. Buckland was one of the first women nurses to arrive in Gettysburg after the battle. She found wounded men lying in the streets and feared walking on them as she passed by. She remembered, they lay like trees uprooted by a tornado, their lives slowly ebbing away. She was directed to nurse those in the field outside the hospital. She wrote that she was thankful that I had been sent to aid, even though she had faced a line of stretchers 1.5 miles long. She washed agonized faces, combed matted hair, bandaged slight wounds. She administered drinks to the injured, raspberry vinegar and lemon syrup. That's a new one on me. Hospital beds were set up in rows, and she gave her own mattress for one of the wounded. She was startled that there were Confederate soldiers among the wounded. She not always approved of them, but she insisted that all were treated equally, whatever my hands found to do. Despite her own hunger, swollen feet, and weary limbs, she contended with miserably quartermasters, unreasonable rules, and surly medical men who had no use for women in the hospital. But she praised the kindly doctors she encountered. She nursed through the summer and into the fall, praying that she had grown familiar with death in every shape. One soldier reported she would recommend her for a pension as she had done more than any one man to put down the rebellion. She left the account of the newly opened National Cemetery in Gettysburg and was there the day that it was dedicated. She later went back to D.C. and remained a nurse till the end of the war, dying in Ithaca, New York in 1902. Speaking of other nurses that came afterwards, Cornelia Hancock, not related to the general. She came to Gettysburg July 5th to accompany her brother-in-law, Dr. Henry Child, to the battlefield. They had made their way as far as the Baltimore train station with other female volunteers, and they had encountered Dorothea Dix, who had established strict standards for the female nurses that we mentioned in the other slide. Insisting that they be mature in years, at least 30, claimed almost a homeliness in dress, and by no means liberally endowed with personal attractions. In her memoir, written after the war, Mrs. Hancock described her encounter with Dix. She looked the nurses over and pronounced them all suitable except me. She immediately objected to my going farther on the score of my youth and rosy cheeks. I was then just 23 years of age. In those days, it was considered indecorous for angels of mercy to appear otherwise than gray-haired and spectacled. Such a thing as a hospital for the comely young maiden nurses was then unknown. A colleague challenged Dix on behalf of Hancock, but the young woman did wait to hear the outcome. The discussion waxed warm, and I have no idea what conclusion they came to. For I settled the question myself for getting on the car and staying in my seat until the train pulled out. They had ended up making it to Gettysburg. They had not forcibly taken me from the train, so I got into Gettysburg on the night of July 6th. She served as a nurse in other capacities until the end of the war. In 1866, she used funds from Philadelphia Quakers and the Freedmen's Bureau to open the Lang School for Negroes in South Carolina, where she taught for 10 years. Later moved to Philadelphia and founded the Children's Aid Society and the Society for Organizing Charity. She died in Atlantic City in 1927. So you probably have not seen a picture of Cornelia Hancock, who was a nurse after the battle. Here's another one. Some women caring for the wounded was a family affair. Have you friends in the Army, madam? Asked a wounded rebel soldier, as Georgiana Woolsey, known as Georgie, attended to. Yes, my brother is on General Meade's staff. I thought so. You can always tell when people are good to soldiers, they're sure to have friends in the Army. As nurses at Gettysburg, Woolsey and her mother worked for 3 weeks near the railroad depot, feeding and caring for men being sent to hospitals in Baltimore and Harrisburg. She later wrote a pamphlet about her experiences for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which ordered and distributed 10,000 copies. After the war, she married and moved to New Haven, Connecticut, where she founded the Connecticut Training School for Nurses. Died in New Haven, Connecticut in 1906. Now for a few of the Confederate nurses that we know at Gettysburg. There are two that are definitely there. Lucinda Horn was born in 1814. Was from South Carolina, accompanied her husband and son to war. She served as a regimental nurse, cook, and laundress. Sort of a big deal. Without the weaponry. In Company K of the 14th South Carolina, commanded by Joseph Brown, which was in Perrin's Brigade in Dorsey, Penner's Division in A.B. Hill's Corps. She survived the war unscathed, and although both her husband and son sustained wounds, they also survived. They all returned home to South Carolina. And in the 1880s, it is reported that Lucinda and her husband went to work as peddlers selling pottery. She died in 1896. Rose Quinn Rooney is the other one that they know of that were definitely at Gettysburg as Confederate nurses. She was again nurse, cook, laundress with Company K of the 15th Louisiana Regiment. Commanded by Major Brady at Gettysburg, which was in Nichols' Brigade and Edward Allegheny Johnson's division of Ewell's Second Corps from June 61 until the end of the war. There are reports of her on the field under fire at the Battle of First Bull Run and at Gettysburg. I have not found those reports, but I need to look further. When some of the men in her regiment were briefly imprisoned after Appomattox, she insisted on joining them. After the war, she became a matron of the soldiers' home in New Orleans. There's her green. South Carolina. Nurse Company K, 14th Regiment, Confederate Airway. How many people have heard of Lydia Hamilton Smith? All right, she was the longtime housekeeper of abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens, prominent African-American businesswoman after his death, born near Russell Tavern near Gettysburg and one former African-American. She married a free black man, Jacob Smith, with whom she had 2 sons. After the battle, she borrowed a horse and wagon and drove through Adams County, telling people of the thousands of wounded men. She accepted donations of food and clothing for the wounded. When the donations dried up, she began spending her own money. Each day, with her wagons filled with supplies, she drove to the various field hospitals where she distributed the articles, food, clothing, and delicacy to Union and Confederate soldiers alike for several weeks. And you may know about the Daughters of Charity of Emmitsburg, who later came up after the battle as well. From Emmitsburg, they fed the soldiers at St. Joseph, and the St. Joseph's Rectory was requisitioned for military headquarters. General Howard, later the founder of Howard University, was among those at the rectory. Surrounded by soldiers, the sisters prayed that the battle they knew was coming would not be fought on their land. As we know, the battle moved north to Gettysburg. Father Orlando, the director of the Daughters of Charity, wrote, on July 1st, the battle commenced about 9 miles from Emmitsburg. Continued for 3 days. 200,000 men were in the field, and on each side there were from 100 to 130 pieces of cannon. Nor these agents of destruction, death and destruction were fearful in the extreme, and their smoke rising to heaven formed dense clouds as during a frightful tempest. The army of the South was defeated, and in their retreat left their dead and wounded on the battlefield. What number of victims perished during this bloody engagement? No one knows yet, but it is estimated that the figures rise to 50,000. We know that's total wounded, captured, missing. On Sunday after the battle, several sisters and Father Orlando set off to Gettysburg. They began to take care of the wounded, setting up operations in various churches, hotels, wherever they could find a spot. They were assigned in pairs to various locations. And the next day, more sisters arrived, some from Baltimore, some from St. Joseph. Down in, as we mentioned before, government supplies began to arrive to supplement what the sisters had been able to provide. For as long as they were wounded, the sisters nursed the sick and comforted and baptized the dying of both armies. One group of nearly 200 men was cared for in the field for 3 weeks until they could be taken to hospitals in New York and Philadelphia. There's one of the sisters, Charity, Sister Camelia O'Keefe. Now, how many people have been inside that monument? How many people have looked inside and saw any women's name? None of you? Okay. And in addition to the unique design of the monument to the 12th and 44th New York, also known as we refer to it as the castle. I had talked to a licensed battlefield guy when I was putting this program together. She said, you know, there's one woman named inside the monument in the castle. I said, really? And she told me. I said, okay, well, I'm going to go take pictures for my website and the PowerPoint. So inside, the bronze tablets are very interesting because they list not only individual officers and lower ranking soldiers, but they also list commissary sergeants, hospital stewards, band members. They have like the drum major is listed, sutlers, and a nurse, Laura A. Hudson Bissell. Harriet Well Corning is the other one, and she was the patron of the regimental flags. I'm assuming she's related to the Corning last word. I never really looked into the details, but she was a wealthy family, and I'm sure that's the connection. But that she paid for the flag. So here's the nurse. Laura A. Hudson Bissell, daughter of a Baptist clergyman, was born near Albany in 1839. She became a school teacher and wrote the words to the poem Ellsworth Avengers to honor Colonel Elmer Ellsworth of the 11th New York Infantry, the first Union officer killed in the Civil War. Members of the 44th New York had learned of the song and called upon her and asked permission to adopt the words as its regimental song. Learning of her desire to serve her country, they invited her to accompany them as the daughter of the regiment. She did so and joined the regiment as a volunteer nurse, later marrying Dr. Bissell, assistant surgeon of the 44th New York. So there's her name. Laura A. Hudson Bissell, volunteer nurse. Now the other one, if you look to the steps, you're going up the steps to go up to the top of the castle. There's a big flag, and one of the flags has this language, a tribute to a patriotic woman, Mrs. Harriet Well Corning, who presented the 44th Regiment, the colors under which it fought. So she's actually mentioned on there. And the sidebar to that is the battlefield guy that told me about this was a former school teacher. And I said, I went over, I took pictures. I said, you know, there's 2 women mentioned in there. She said, no, really? I said, yeah. And I told her. She didn't know. She goes, you get an A+. So I guess school teachers, they never change. Now. This gentleman over here. Was at Gettysburg. He served in Company A, 12th U.S. Regulars, wounded July 2nd. Defending the wheat field and the Valley of Death and in front of Little Round Top, etc. Covering the retreat of the Union troops. Shot through both legs. Did not lose the legs. He convalesced, I'm guessing because it was the 5th Corps at the Jacob Whitewood farm. He might have seen Tilly Pierce. That's my guess. I can't say for sure. He later spent time in the hospital in York, hospital in Baltimore, hospital in DC, and then eventually the hospital in Columbus, Ohio, where he originally was from, Columbus, Ohio. But before he went from or to Baltimore, he went from the Whitewood farm down to a lady's house in Littlestown. The lady took care of him, where he convalesced. And after he got discharged in 1864, he came back, married her, took her back to Ohio. But by 1883, she was homesick for Gettysburg. So the gentleman bought what is known as Granite Hill Campground. That was their 178 acre farm. That is the back of the house, like the back wall. This is like the porch, back porch, family photo. That's a song. There's Laura Will. The reason why I have that in the story is because from what I've been told from the Adams County Historical Society, they know of 5 soldiers who came back and married local women. They have never given me the other 4. But that is my great-great-grandfather, Felix. So if he hadn't been shot through both legs, I wouldn't be talking. And if she hadn't taken care of him, I wouldn't be talking. So. When he was too old to farm, he offered the farm to his 7. I think he had 5 sons, 2 daughters. I think the sons had enough of farming. He gave it to the 1 daughter. He came to Springs Avenue and built this. It's like a Sears catalog house that he built. You can see one of those buildings at Gettysburg College. I like the outhouse. There's Felix and Laura. You can't really see. That's a family photo. And 109 Springs Avenue. That's a semi-colorized version. I don't know if you can see the color. That's the house today. It was up for sale 20 years ago for $335,000. I could handle everything with the last 0. But I contacted the realtor and I said, my ancestor built that house. Do you mind if I take a look inside? She said, no, go right ahead. So she gave me a tour. She talked about the house. And on the wall, in the one back room, was that photograph I showed you of the ones out front. I said, that's my family. I said, now I know why it's on the wall. So she ended up buying the house. The realtor, she still lives there. She has not damaged it or changed it for the fire leaves at all. And one thing I also pointed out to her was the fancy blocks above doorways. I don't know what the term is, I'm not an architect. But when I first walked in, I said, Maltese cross. He was in the 5th Corps. She's interesting. So she got a little bit of details. But I have relatives that I bring to Gettysburg now and then. She's always allowed us to take a tour of our ancestors' house. And that concludes the program. Yes, sir.
Randy, the story of your great, uncle, whatever.
Grandfather, yes.
There was a picture of the soldier. The story is he's standing with his family at a picnic on a large rock there on the ridge where he was wounded. He was a regular, U.S. regular on House Ridge. And would this be the same soldier?
No, there's no photos of him in action. I would love to have one of him in uniform, but all I have is the older photo.
Yeah, this would have been.
Like a reunion.
He was there with his family on a picnic and supposedly he was wounded there. And at the time, he took shelter behind that big rock. And he was pointing out to his family where he was situated.
Well, I'm sure there were a couple of accounts where that occurred, people hiding, getting cover behind it. There's many stories that I could refer to right now. Yes, sir.
Is there another story behind that where the two women that were with the Confederate Army were sent to prison while they were attending?
General Jude Early, as we all know, was a little
Squirrel.
so he did not like the fact, apparently he did not like the fact that there were women in his army. And especially if they pulled it off, he probably felt, and I'm surmising that he felt bad that they were able to get away with it. They said, well, they gotta be punished. And that's what happened, as opposed to getting him rewarded.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Sometimes. Yes, sir.
I know the soldiers wouldn't admit this, but did Josephine Miller ever say anything about any soldiers stopping for bread as she was baking at her house?
There's nothing in writing. It's possible if you find some soldiers' personal accounts, letters, maybe, but I've never seen any.
Yeah, soldiers probably wouldn't admit that.
Any other questions? Do we have one minute here? All right, since we talked about the Rogers house and the Sherpy house. I do on occasion photo reenactments. And we did one on March 4th of 1913 reunion photos that involve General Sickles. And two of the participants are in the room, Bill Voelkel and Linda Bean. We had 30 participants from 5 states and DC. From Ohio, West Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and our photographer was a professional photographer who came in from Michigan. Then we have been doing these reenactments every now and then, these photo reenactments. But because of COVID, it took us 2 years to get this thing finally approved. But I'm going to leave these photographs up here. Well, I'll just hold them up first. This is one.
I'll try to zoom in here
Okay.
for our friends at home. That's great.
Okay.
Yep.
And this is not the best version, but it's the other photograph.
Cool.
And here's our reenactment, our best photo.
Great.
Okay, sure. This is the reenactment of the other.
Oh, I see.
I just thought I would throw that in because of it, we were talking about the Sherfy house and the Rogers house. The Rogers house did not survive. It was originally a log cabin during the battle, didn't survive after the war too long, 1880s, 1890s. A modern quote unquote house survived till the 50s until the park, I think, took it down. And that's why there's just a sign that says Peter Rogers House was here. So to do this reenactment photo of the Peter Rogers House, we had to get permission from the Gettysburg Foundation, and thanks to Bill Volk helping with Wayne Motzi, executive director, we got permission to do it at the Sherfy House, which is only about a quarter mile, half a mile down the road and on the same side of the road, and the architectural features are close enough. So I want to thank Bill again for his help getting it lined up with Wayne. It's a lot of fun to like recreate history. And I always want to know what they're thinking when they're looking up. The first ones we did was down at Hanover Junction in 2016. We did two photographs. One was the famous one whether or not that's Abraham Lincoln in a photograph with the train. And then the other smaller photograph of a lot of the individuals on the train platform. So that's how all this got started. It's a lot of fun. And like, you know, it's an interesting way to relearn history. All right, well, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
This is.
No, it's mine.
I'll leave it there then.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our friends.
I think it's within it. Did you add that in there?
Oh, Scott, maybe just. Thanks to our friends at home, and we'll see you on April 19th.
Hey, look what someone donated. What? Somebody donated this towards the. They took the picture.
They didn't like it, huh?
No, the guy